Good evening, friends, fiends, and night owl supremes. Welcome to A Bit Late. Tonight we are reading a fairer fairy tale. That's right, Fairer Than a Fairy, which is a neat little story that I found and wanted to share with you. It is interesting, as most old fairy tales are, but I hope you've had a great day, are in the middle of a great evening, or are in the middle of a great sleep. Well, if you're listening to this, you're probably not sleeping, so hey, how's it going? Hi! But as per usual, gather around you blankets, animal familiars, hot chocolate tea, decaf coffee, light those candles because it is the chilly season. Or not. They just smell good sometimes. You just need some lavender or apple cider candle in your life. Anyway, without further ado from me, let's get into tonight's fairy tale, Fairer Than a Fairy. Once there lived a king who had no children for many years after his marriage. At length he was granted a daughter of such remarkable beauty that he could think of no name so appropriate for her as, quote, fairer than a fairy, quote. It never occurred to the good-natured monarch that such a name was certain to call down the hatred and jealousy of the fairies and embody on the child, but this was what happened. No sooner had they heard of this presumptuous name than they resolved to gain possession of her who bore it, and either to torment her cruelly or at least to conceal from her the eyes of all men. But what if women were into it? Anyway, the eldest of their tribe was entrusted to carry out their revenge. This fairy was named Lagree. She was so old that she only had one eye and one tooth left, and it seems like Fairer Than a Fairy is fairer than this fairy. And even these poor remains she had to keep all night in a strengthening liquid. Like sap? This is intriguing. She was also so spiteful that she gladly devoted all her time to carrying out the mean or ill-natured tricks of the whole body of fairies. I think it's fair to say spite and sap is keeping that fairy alive. With her large experience added to her native spite, she found but little difficulty in carrying off Fairer Than a Fairy. The poor child, who was only 7 years old, nearly died of fear on finding herself in the power of this hideous creature. She waited till the child was 7? Really? Also magical fairy number. Woo! However, when after an hour's journey underground she found herself in a splendid palace with lovely gardens, she felt a little reassured, and was further cheered when she discovered that her pet cat and dog had followed her. Oh, that's adorable. That's great. That's awesome. I'd be happy too, I suppose. The old fairy led her to a pretty room which she said should be hers, and at the same time giving her the strictest orders never to let out the fire which was burning brightly in the grate. I wonder why. She then gave 2 glass bottles into the princess's charge, desiring her to take the greatest care of them. And having enforced her orders with the most awful threats in case of disobedience, she vanished, leaving the little girl at liberty to explore the palace and the grounds, and a good deal relieved at having only 2 apparently easy tasks set to her. Several years passed, cue montage, during which time the princess grew accustomed to her lonely life, obeyed the fairy's orders, and by degrees forgot all about the court of the king, her father. One day, whilst passing near a fountain in the garden, she noticed that the sun's rays fell on the water in such a manner as to produce a brilliant rainbow. She stood to admire it when, to her great surprise, she heard a voice addressing her which seemed to come from the center of its rays. The voice was that of a young man, and its sweetness of tone and the agreeable things it utters led one to infer that its owner must be equally charming. But this was to be a mere matter of fancy, for no one was visible. The beautiful rainbow informed Fairer Than a Fairy that he was young, the son of a powerful king, and that the fairy, Lagree, who owed his parents a grudge, had revenged herself by depriving him of his natural shape for some years. This is either all true or a big catfishing scheme. That she had imprisoned him in the palace, where he had found his confinement hard to bear for some time, but now he owned he no longer sighed for freedom since he had seen and learned to love Fairer Than a Fairy. What? But they talked one time, and he doesn't have a body to see her. Unless there's other fairy magics at work here. He added many other tender speeches to this declaration, I'm sure he did. And the princess, to whom such remarks were a new experience, could not help feeling pleased and touched by his attentions. Oh no. The prince could only appear to speak under the form of a rainbow, and it was therefore necessary that the sun should shine on the water so as to enable the rays to form themselves. I do find it interesting that he can only speak when he's this ephemeral collection of light waves. That's not even a thing, really, but a phenomenon. It's cool. Anyway, Fairer Than a Fairy lost no moment in which she could meet her lover, and they enjoyed many a long and interesting interview. One day, however, their conversation became so absorbing and time passed so quickly that the princess forgot to attend the fire, and it went out. Lagree, on her return, soon found out the neglect and seemed only too pleased to have the opportunity of showing her spite to her lovely prisoner. She ordered Fairer Than a Fairy to start the next day at dawn to ask Locrinos for fire with which to relight the one she had allowed to go out. Now, this Locrinos was a monster who devoured everyone he came across, and especially enjoyed a chance of catching and eating any young girls. My, how convenient. Our heroine obeyed with great sweetness, and without having been able to take leave of her lover, she set off to go to Locrinos as to certain death. As she was crossing a wood, a bird sang to her to pick up a shining pebble which she would find in a fountain close by, and use it when it was needed. She took the bird's advice and in due time arrived at the house of Locrinos. Luckily, she only found his wife at home, who was much struck by the princess's youth and beauty and such gentle manners, and still further impressed by the present of the shining pebble. So we're to assume that Locrinos' wife does not approve of him eating the young girls, and that's nice. She readily let Fairer Than Fairy have the fire, and in return for the stone, she gave her another which, she said, might prove useful someday. Then she sent her away without doing her any harm. That's lucky break. Lagree was as much surprised as displeased at the happy result of this expedition, and Fairer Than a Fairy waited anxiously for an opportunity of meeting Prince Rainbow and telling him her adventures. She found, however, that he had already been told all about them by a fairy who protected him and to whom he was related. So she didn't even get to tell him her great story, spoiled by another fairy. The dread of fresh dangers to his beloved princess made him devise some more convenient way of meeting than by the garden fountain, and Fairer Than a Fairy carried out his plan daily with entire success. Well, that's good. Every morning she placed a large basin full of water on her windowsill, and as soon as the sun's rays fell on the water and the rainbow appeared as clearly as it had done in the fountain. By this means they were able to meet without losing sight of the fire or the 2 bottles with which the old fairy kept her eye in her tooth at night. Oh, Lagree keeps her eye in one and the tooth in one? Weird. But why not keep them in your tooth, in your mouth, and your head? And why give them to your prisoner to guard? I think we'll find out, but this is weird. Regardless, for some time the lovers enjoyed each hour of sunshine together. One day Prince Rainbow appeared in the depths of woe. He had just heard that he was to be banished from this lovely spot, but he had no idea where he was to go. The poor young couple were in despair, and only parted with the last ray of sunshine and in hopes of meeting the next morning. Alas, the next day was dark and gloomy, and it was only late in the afternoon that the sun broke through the clouds for a few minutes. Fairer Than a Fairy eagerly ran to the window, but in her haste she upset the basin and spilt all the water with which she had carefully filled it overnight. No other water was at hand except that in the 2 bottles. Oh no! It was the only chance of seeing her lover before they were separated, and she did not hesitate to break the bottle and pour their contents into the basin, when the rainbow appeared at once. Their farewells were full of tenderness. The prince made the most ardent and sincere declarations and promised to neglect nothing which might help to deliver his dear friend, Fairer Than a Fairy, from her captivity, and implored her to consent to their marriage as soon as they should both be free. The princess, on her side, vowed to have no other husband and declared herself willing to brave death itself in order to rejoin him. That is some deep love based on some deep conversations. It's kind of like they're in quarantine with the virus running out unchecked and they can only meet on Zoom or something. This might be relatable for nowadays. They were not allowed much time for their adieus, and the rainbow vanished, and the princess, resolved to run all risks, started off at once, taking nothing with her but her dog, her cat, a sprig of myrtle, and the stone with which the wife of Locrinos gave her. Gotta take the cat and dog. Agree. Hard agree. When Legree became aware of her prisoner's flight, she was furious and set off at full speed in pursuit. She overtook her just as the poor girl, overcome by fatigue, had laid down to rest in a cave which the stone itself had formed around her to shelter her. The little dog, who was watching her mistress, promptly flew at Legree and bit her so severely that she stumbled against a corner of the cave and broke off her only tooth. That was in the bottle? But not? Before she had recovered from the pain and rage this caused her, the princess had time to escape and was some way on her road. Fear gave her strength for some time, but at last she could go no further and sank down to rest. As she did so, the sprig of myrtle she carried touched the ground, and immediately a green and shady bower sprang up around her, in which she hoped to sleep in peace. But Legree had not given up her pursuit and arrived just as Fairer than a Fairy had fallen asleep. This time she made sure of catching her victim, but the cat spied her out, and springing from one of the boughs of the arbor, she flew at Legree's face and tore out her only eye, thus delivering the princess forever from her pursuer. Getting Coraline and other mother cat vibes here, where the cat just rips off the button eye. In the movie, that is. One might have thought that all would now be well, but no sooner had Legree been put to fight than our heroine was overwhelmed with hunger and thirst. She felt as though she should certainly expire, and it was with some difficulty that she dragged herself as far as a pretty little green and white house, which stood at no great distance. Here she was received by a beautiful lady dressed in green and white to match the house, which apparently belonged to her, as she matched it, and of which she seemed to be the only inhabitant. She greeted the fainting princess most kindly, gave her an excellent supper, and after a long night's rest in a delightful bed, told her that after many troubles she should finally attain her desire. As the green and white lady took leave of the princess, she gave her a nut, desiring her only to open it in the most urgent need. And nuts in fairy tales contain a lot. After a long and tiring journey, Fairer than a Fairy was once more received in a house, and by a lady exactly like the one she had quitted. Did she move? Is she in a loop? Here again she received a present with the same injunctions, but instead of a nut, this lady gave her a golden pomegranate. The mournful princess had to continue her weary way, and after many troubles and hardships, she found rest and shelter in a third house exactly similar to the two other houses. I'm getting underworld vibes from this journey now that there's a pomegranate involved. Like she's going through death and she has a pomegranate, you know what I mean, like a Persephone Hades type deal. But now she's been to 3 houses. These houses belong to 3 sisters, all endowed with fairy gifts, and all so alike in mind and person that they wish their houses and garments to be equally alike. Their occupation consisted in helping those in misfortune, and they were as gentle and benevolent as Legree had been cruel and spiteful. The 3rd fairy comforted the poor traveler, begged her not to lose heart, and assured her that her troubles should be rewarded. She accompanied her advice by the gift of a crystal smelling bottle, with strict orders only to open it in the case of urgent need. Fairer than a Fairy thanked her warmly and resumed her way, cheered by pleasant thoughts. After a time, her road led through a wood, full of soft airs and sweet odors, and before she had gone 100 yards, she saw a wonderful silver castle suspended by strong silver chains to 4 of the largest trees. It was so perfectly hung that a gentle breeze rocked it sufficiently to send you pleasantly to sleep. Oh, what a nice picture. But I'll tell you what, if the prince is in this castle that's gently rocking people to sleep and not in a dire situation, and he's just waiting there, come on. He could have just walked out and gone to her. But then it wouldn't be an interesting story, perhaps. And I kind of like following a girl, princess, not the son of a king, for once. I mean, this isn't the first time we've done that, but it's always refreshing, you know? Fairer than a Fairy felt a strong desire to enter this castle, but besides being hung a little above the ground, there seemed to be neither doors nor windows. She had no doubt, though really I cannot think why, that the moment had come in which to use the nut which had been given her. She opened it, and out came a diminutive hall porter at whose belt hung a tiny chain, at the end of which was a golden key half as long as the smallest pin you ever saw. That is tiny, tiny, tiny. The princess climbed up one of the silver chains, not the small ones, the big ones holding the castle, okay, holding her hand to the little porter who, in spite of his minute size, opened a secret door with his golden key and let her in. She entered a magnificent room which appeared to occupy the entire castle, and which was lighted by gold and jeweled stars in the ceiling. Oh, beautiful. In the midst of this room stood a couch draped with curtains of all colors of the rainbow and suspended by golden cords so that it swayed with the castle in a manner which rocked its occupant delightfully to sleep. There's a lot of sleep in this castle. Physics are escaping me, but wouldn't that just hang in the middle like a gyroscope, like unmoving if the castle shifted? Or would it move? Probably would move. Anyway, I'm sure it's comfortable if it moves or not. But this story says it's moving, so it's moving. On this elegant couch lay Prince Rainbow, of course, looking more beautiful than ever. Because she's seen him, well, she's seen a rainbow, so this guy's more beautiful than a rainbow, and sunk in profound slumber in which he had been held ever since his disappearance. Ah, so he's been sleeping in a slumbering castle for so long. That's why they couldn't talk. Comfy prison, but still sleeping forever. It's uncomfortable when women sleep forever in fairy tales, and it's not exactly comfortable even when it's a dude sleeping forever in fairy tales. A lot of stuff can happen. Anyway, he's sleeping. He looks so charming, prettier than a rainbow in his sleep. We now have the answer to our mystery. Fairer than a fairy, who now saw him for the first time in his real shape, hardly dared to gaze at him, fearing at least his appearance might not be in keeping with the voice and language that had won her heart. At the same time, she could not help feeling rather hurt at the apparent indifference with which she was received. I mean, he's snoozing through their first meeting. That kind of stinks. She related all the dangers and difficulties she had gone through, and though she repeated the story 20 times in a loud, clear voice, the prince slept on and took no heed. She then had recourse to the golden pomegranate, and on opening it found that all the seeds were as many little violins which flew up in the vaulted roof and at once began playing melodiously. Oh my god, I did not expect that, and I love it. Oh, I love it. The prince was not completely roused, but he opened his eyes a little and looked all the handsomer. Oh. Impatient at not being recognized, Fairer than a Fairy now drew out her third present, and on opening the crystal scent bottle, a little siren flew out who silenced the violins and sang close to the prince's ear the story of all his lady love had suffered in search for him. She added some gentle reproaches to her tale, but before she had got far he was wide awake, and transported with joy threw himself at the princess's feet. At the same moment the walls of the room expanded and opened out, revealing a golden throne covered with jewels. A magnificent court now began to assemble, and at the same time several elegant carriages filled with ladies in magnificent dresses drove up. In the first and most splendid of these carriages sat Prince Rainbow's mother. Oh, Mom! Just waiting till the spell was broken to show up? Okay. She fondly embraced her son, after which she informed him that his father had been dead for some years. Oh, hi, son, I love you, your dad's been dead. And that the anger of the fairies was at length appeased, and that he might return in peace to reign over his people, who were longing for his presence. But no one could help him before now. That's the thing, even in Beauty and the Beast this happens. All the fairies show up after things are good. The court received the new king with joyful acclamations, which would have delighted him at any other time, but all his thoughts were full of Fairer than a Fairy, as they should be. He was just about to present her to his mother and to the court, feeling sure that her charms would win all hearts, when the 3 green and white sisters appeared. They declared the secret of Fairer than a Fairy's royal birth, and the queen, taking the 2 lovers in her carriage, set off with them for the capital of the kingdom. So Fairer than a Fairy didn't have to prove herself because of her good heart or anything like that, but, oh, she's royalty, it's cool, you guys go ahead, have fun, says the mother. Anyway, here they were received with tumultuous joy. The wedding was celebrated without delay, and succeeding years diminished neither the virtuous beauty nor the mutual affection of King Rainbow and his queen, Fairer than a Fairy. The end. Well, that was certainly a delightful tale. I love little gifts that fairies give. Pomegranates of gold with little violins. Come on. A little nut with a little guy inside that has a little chain and a littler key. Oh my god. And then smelling salts, which turned out to be a siren. that was saying the same things the princess was, but in a different way. I love it. And I hope you enjoyed listening to the tale as well. I have some interesting stories coming up, so do be sure to stay tuned. And there's a lot in this story that I would like to dive into at another time. But for now, off to sleep and dream what you will, or stay a while and enjoy another tale. Whichever you choose, I'll speak to you again. And until then, stay spooky, my friends, and get rocked to sleep by a castle of silver chains. Good night!